Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be diving into the second tier of the missing persons iceberg, going through a group of disappearances that receive some public attention, but aren't as widely known as those we've previously discussed. This video is third in a series, so if you haven't seen the previous two, I'll have those linked down below, but you don't need to watch these in any particular order. I'll also add that several of the disappearances we'll be discussing today are still being investigated, so I'll be leaving the relevant investigating agencies in the description box. And if you have any information that could help the families of the missing find answers and closure, I highly recommend you submit a tip. Now, without further ado, let's begin with the story of Maura Murray. Maura Murray was born on May 4th, 1982 in Brockton, Massachusetts, as the youngest of 5 children. She was often described as ambitious and friendly, and in school she excelled in both academics and athletics. In high school, she took a particular interest in running and was consistently ranked as one of the top runners in the state. When it came time for college, she followed in her older sister Julie's footsteps by attending West Point, where she studied chemical engineering and ran on both the cross-country and track and field teams. However, during her second year, she decided that she didn't want to go into the military, and transferred to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she decided to study nursing. On Monday, February 9th, 2004, the 21-year-old emailed her professors saying there had been a death in her family and that she wouldn't be able to attend classes for the week. This claim was later determined to be untrue. She then called a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire, asking about a room for rent. She didn't end up booking a room here, but packed a bag full of toiletries, makeup, school books, and a few items of clothing and placed them all in her car. At 3:15 p.m., Maura withdrew $280 from an off-campus ATM. This was just about all of the money she had in her account. She then drove her black 1996 Saturn to a nearby liquor store and bought $40 worth of alcohol. She left the Amherst area around 4:30 and began driving in the direction of New Hampshire. That we know of, Maura told no one where she was going or what business she had out of town. About 3 hours later, at 7:27 p.m., a woman named Faith Westman, a resident of Haverhill, New Hampshire, called the police to report a car accident that had just occurred outside of her home. It appeared as though the driver had missed a sharp turn in the road and run into a ditch, where the car had gotten stuck. The driver of this car was later determined to be Maura Murray. Moments after the first 911 call, a bus driver named Butch Atwood stopped on the side of the road to check on the woman involved in the crash. "I told her I was going to run up to my house and call the police," he said. She said, No, please don't. I already called AAA. Well, under my breath I said, "That's a lie. You can't make a cell call from here." Indeed, there was no evidence found that Maura had called AAA that night. While Butch said that Maura appeared shaken up but not obviously injured, he said that she may have been intoxicated. Because this encounter didn't feel quite right, Butch then got back into his vehicle and drove only 100 yards to his own home and called 911 at exactly 7:42 p.m. Only 4 minutes later, authorities arrived on the scene, but Maura Murray was already gone. The locked Saturn had been left at the scene, and when peering inside, the arriving officers saw a box of wine behind the driver's seat, along with stains on the car's ceiling and door. Once they were able to get inside the car, police found a printed-out set of directions to Burlington, Vermont. They also found a white piece of fabric shoved in the car's tailpipe, but according to some sources, this was something Maura's father had advised her to do to avoid being ticketed by police for excessive smoke. Some notable items missing from the car included Maura's cell phone and credit and bank cards, along with some of the alcohol she had bought only hours earlier. One police officer, at the direction of Butch Atwood, started searching west of the accident for a lone woman on foot. 8 firefighters arrived soon after, and briefly searched the crash site before leaving. According to Maura's family, as far as anyone knows, no one searched east of the crash site in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. An important detail about the crash site was that there were no footprints in the snow around the car, and investigators found no sign of a struggle. Additionally, a tracker dog brought to the scene 2 days later lost her scent within 100 yards of the crash. This led police to believe that Maura had climbed into a car soon after Butch Atwood left her at the scene. And seeing as this interaction was the last known time she was ever seen, many feared that this proposed driver may have had ill intent when picking up Maura. Still, there was no clear evidence that this is what occurred. After a little over a week of ground and aerial searches for Maura, her father reported that the search had become stagnant. There was, and still is, much confusion over Maura's mindset on the day of her disappearance. Some say her behavior may have been due to mental health struggles, and that she may have been suicidal. Some have backed up this theory with the fact that after her disappearance, Maura's dorm room was found to be packed up, with her posters taken off the walls. Others believe her behavior may have been stress-induced. To give credence to this point, I should mention that 2 days before her disappearance, Maura had crashed her father's brand new car after leaving an off-campus party. The damage totaled about $10,000. She felt she had disappointed me, her father said. Let me down, like any kid would. Another event that could have caused extreme stress in Maura's life was her being accused of credit card fraud about 3 months before her disappearance. It appears that she had ordered food using another person's credit card, but there wasn't much more confirmed information I could find about this. However, it seems that the case had been resolved sometime before she vanished. While we can speculate on Maura's mindset at the time of her disappearance, there is little we can say for certain as to why she behaved the way she did. Police and Maura's family still fear that she could have been picked up or abducted by someone after the crash, and that this may have been simply a crime of opportunity. However, as previously said, there is little we can say for certain. Now, there are many more details and theories related to this case that I can't really do justice in this format, so if you would like a more in-depth video on Maura Murray's disappearance, please let me know. I would also recommend checking out a TikTok account called Maura Murray Missing, which is run by Maura's sister Julie and goes through many of the finer details of her case. I'll have that link down below, but overall, it has been 19 years since Maura vanished, and no trace of her has been found. Her case remains unsolved. Brian Shaffer was born on February 25, 1979, as the oldest child of Randy and Renee Shaffer. His childhood was spent in Pickering, Ohio, a suburb outside of Columbus. After graduating high school in 1997, Brian decided to pursue a bachelor's in microbiology at Ohio State University, and afterwards began studying at OSU's medical school with hopes of becoming a doctor. It was during his second year of medical school that Brian disappeared inexplicably during a night out with friends, leaving behind more questions than answers. The night was Friday, March 31, 2006. OSU's classes had just wrapped up for spring break, so Brian's father Randy took his son out to dinner to celebrate. Brian was said to seem tired that night, although this was understandable since he had pulled several all-nighters the week prior. He told his father that later that night, he'd be going out with his friend and former roommate, Clint Florence, to celebrate the end of classes. Randy didn't think Brian should be going out in his condition, but he didn't end up voicing his concerns to his son. At 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, where they opened a tab and took several shots of hard liquor. About an hour later, Brian's girlfriend, Alexis, called to check in on him. The couple had met during their first year of medical school, and while they hadn't been dating for very long, they were head over heels for each other. For spring break, the pair had planned to go to Miami, Florida, where many of their friends and family believed Brian would be proposing to her. In preparation for this trip, Alexis had gone back home to see her family for the weekend, and on her call with Brian, she said that everything seemed ordinary with him, and that there was no indication that anything was wrong. After this call, Brian and Clint walked to several more bars down the street, downing a shot every time they stopped somewhere. It was sometime during this bar crawl where the pair ran into one of Clint's friends, Meredith, and she joined them as they walked back to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, which of course was where they began the night. At 1:15 a.m., security footage caught the trio coming up the escalator that led to the bar. While inside, they ran into a few women that Clint knew, and at 1:55 a.m., security footage caught him for the last time talking to these two women. At some point during their conversation, Brian walks out of frame, seeming to walk back towards the bar. He is never seen again, not by any eyewitnesses or his friends, and he is not seen leaving the bar on any security footage. Only a few minutes later, the bar began shutting down for the night, and Clint, who had gotten separated from Brian sometime earlier, began looking for his friend. He and Meredith went around the bar calling for Brian and tried his cell phone a few times, but got no response. After checking the bathrooms and being confident that he was no longer in the building, they left the bar without him, figuring that he had just left without saying goodbye. All of the following Saturday and Sunday, nobody is known to have seen or spoken to Brian, and when call after call went unanswered from his phone, his girlfriend became increasingly worried. They were due to leave for Florida on Monday morning, so when Brian didn't show up for this flight, she reported him missing to Columbus police. Investigators first searched the last location Brian was seen, that being the Ugly Tuna Saloon, where they realized there was no footage of the 27-year-old leaving the premises. This obviously didn't make any sense, as searches of the building turned up no sign of Brian, and both exits were covered by security cameras. The only place where Brian could have exited the building undetected by cameras was through a service door that led to a construction site. Workers and investigators said that this site would have been extremely difficult to walk through, as intoxicated as Brian was. No one could understand why he would have chosen to walk so far out of the way to leave through this exit, but this wasn't the only theory put forth. Another was that Brian could have left in a different outfit than what he arrived in, and kept his face turned away from cameras as he left through one of the main exits. This, of course, brings up the theory that Brian carefully curated his own disappearance, which his family and friends strongly believed to not be the case. As previously mentioned, Brian was in a loving relationship and seemed to have hopes and plans for the future, but I should mention that at the time of Brian's disappearance, he had recently experienced quite a traumatic event, which many have theorized could have affected his behavior. Only 3 weeks earlier, Brian had lost his mother to cancer, and while his friends and family said that he seemed to be doing okay, it was still clear that the loss deeply affected him. But despite some theorizing that he changed out of his clothes that night to purposely vanish, careful consideration of the footage has shown that this was likely not the case. As I said earlier, investigations into this case have left us with more questions than answers. In the over 17 years since his disappearance, investigators and internet sleuths have tried their hand at explaining Brian Shaffer's disappearance, but unfortunately, his case remains unsolved. There has been no trace of him found, and many fear that foul play was involved in his disappearance. Kathie McCormick was born on June 15, 1952, in Queens County, New York. She grew up on Long Island as the fifth and youngest child of her family, and after graduating high school, she started training as a dental hygienist on the east side of Manhattan. The building where she worked was owned by the prolific Durst organization, one of the wealthiest family-run real estate companies in New York City. Kathie's specific building fell under the supervision of 28-year-old Robert Durst, the oldest son of the family patriarch Seymour Durst. It was at this building in the fall of 1971 that the 19-year-old Kathie met Robert, and the two instantly connected. At the time of their meeting, Robert was residing in Vermont and visiting New York City only on occasion. He had recently fulfilled his dream of starting a health food store, which he named All the Good Things, and was in the process of getting it up and running when he met Kathie. She apparently loved the idea, and after only 2 dates with Robert, she moved to Vermont with him to help run the store. However, this dream was only short-lived, as Robert's father soon convinced him to move back to the city and fulfill his duty as the eldest son to work for the family business. After selling the store, Robert and Kathie moved back to Manhattan, where they were married on April 12, 1973. Now that you have some background on Kathie's early life, I want to jump forward about 10 years to the day Kathie was last seen. The date was Sunday, January 31st, 1982. At around 3 p.m., Kathie showed up unannounced at her close friend Gilberta's house, where a family get-together was underway. This friend said that Kathie was noticeably upset and was wearing sweatpants, which was apparently uncharacteristic for her. Over the course of the evening, Kathie confided in Gilberta about the difficulties of her marriage to Robert, and stated that she was afraid her husband would harm her. At around 7 p.m., Kathie got a call from Robert and decided to go home to their cottage in South Salem, New York. Right before she left, she asked Gilberta to investigate in case something bad happened to her. At the time, Gilberta didn't realize the gravity of what Kathie was asking, but this would end up being the last confirmed sighting of Kathie Durst. Robert Durst's account of this night goes as follows. He says that Kathie arrived back at the house around 7:30 p.m. and that it seemed as if she had been drinking. He said that they ate a sandwich together before climbing into the car and driving to the nearby Katona station at around 8:30. It was here that Robert says Kathie boarded a train bound for their Manhattan apartment. He said this was the last he saw of his wife. After this, he said that he drove back to their cottage, but on his way inside, ran into his neighbor Bill Mayer and went to his house for a quick drink. I should note that his neighbor later said that this did not happen. After this, he decided to go for a walk, where he came across a payphone and decided to check in on his wife, who said she had made it back to the apartment and was watching TV. This was said to have occurred at 11 p.m. Now for some context, Kathie was in her final semester of medical school, and the next morning she was scheduled for an early shift at a medical center. But that morning, a woman identifying herself as Kathie called the dean of that school and said that she wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be able to come into work that day. 4 days later, Robert Durst reported his wife missing to the NYPD. In a police interview, Robert relayed his account of January 31st, which we just covered. They believed that Robert was being truthful, as when police asked the doorman of their building if he had seen anything that night, he said that he thought he saw Kathie going up to her apartment. This account, along with the February 1st phone call, led police to believe that Kathie had voluntarily walked away from her life and her marriage. This theory was also pushed by a woman named Susan Berman, a close friend of Robert Durst, who was often described as his unofficial spokesperson. According to the DA's report, Susan characterized Kathie in an unflattering light and suggested that she voluntarily ran off with another man. With little evidence to the contrary, Kathie's case slowly began to go cold. Now for more about Susan Berman, she was the daughter of a man named David Berman, whom she found out later in life had been heavily involved in the organized crime scene of Las Vegas, and she was most well known for her memoirs about being the daughter of a mobster. Susan met Robert in 1967 while she was studying at UCLA, and the two maintained a close friendship into adulthood. Now, I'm skipping over a lot of details here, so if you want a more in-depth look at this story, I highly recommend the HBO documentary, The Jinx, as it goes into much more detail than I'm able to in this video. But to be brief, on or about Christmas Eve in the year 2000, Susan Berman was found murdered in her Los Angeles home, having been shot execution style. Reportedly, she was a very paranoid person, and was known to nail her windows shut and always lock her doors, yet police found no sign of forced entry into the home, leading them to believe that Susan had known the person that murdered her. Now for some context, about a year prior to this, the NYPD launched another investigation into Kathie Durst's disappearance and had started re-interviewing key people in the case. One was the employee that said he saw Kathie going upstairs on January 31st, who now said that he didn't believe the woman was Kathie, but rather someone resembling her. There was also suspicion cast on the February 1st phone call, and many speculated that Robert's close friend Susan Berman could have made that call in place of Kathie. This ongoing investigation was publicly revealed in October of 2000, at which point Robert Durst fled to Galveston, Texas, where he disguised himself as a mute woman and lived far below his means in a rundown apartment. Nearly a year after this, Robert's Galveston neighbor Morris Black was murdered, his body parts found in numerous trash bags floating in Galveston Bay. Police immediately suspected Robert and arrested and charged him with the murder. He was able to post bail, but immediately fled the state and was caught 7 weeks later in Pennsylvania. He was then put back on trial, but claimed he had killed Morris in self-defense. He ended up being acquitted of this murder, but was sentenced to 5 years in prison for bail jumping and evidence tampering. After getting out of prison in 2010, Robert Durst got in contact with a film director named Andrew Jarecki, who had recently put out a movie called All Good Things, based on Robert's life and the disappearance of Kathie Durst. Robert apparently loved the movie, and asked to be personally interviewed by Jarecki. These interviews between Durst and Jarecki went on for years, and ended up becoming the 6-part documentary series, The Jinx. Once again, I highly recommend you watch this series, and I can't get into all of the nitty-gritty details, but in one of these interviews, Robert was caught on a hot mic while going to the restroom. With no one around him, he started speaking to himself, saying, "Killed them all, of course." This recording was turned over to the authorities, and on the night before the final episode of The Jinx came out, Robert was arrested in New Orleans for the murder of Susan Berman. According to the DA's report, in September of 2021, Robert was convicted of Susan Berman's murder with the special circumstance of killing a witness to prevent them from cooperating with law enforcement. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In November of that year, he was charged with the murder of Kathie Durst, but died of cardiac arrest in early 2022 before he could face these charges. It has been over 40 years since Kathie Durst disappeared, and while most are confident that she was murdered by Robert Durst, her whereabouts are still unknown. For now, her case remains unsolved. Lars Mittank was born on February 9, 1986, in Berlin, Germany. Besides this information, we don't know much else about Lars's early life. We do know that for a living, he worked at a power plant and had a girlfriend, plenty of friends, and a close relationship with his parents. On June 30, 2014, The 28-year-old joined 5 of his old schoolmates on a vacation to Varna, a popular beach destination on Bulgaria's Black Sea, and stayed at the Golden Sands Resort. This trip was Lars's first time traveling abroad. By all accounts, this trip went off without a hitch, with one of Lars's friends saying, quote, "The week went by really fast. We relaxed on the beach, swam in the pool, played football, went clubbing." About Lars specifically, he said that he was relaxed and was in a good mood. On July 6th, the day before they would be leaving Varna, Lars got into a fight with several German nationals at a 24-hour McDonald's. Lars didn't personally know any of these men, and the argument was said to be over rivaling German football teams. Without his friends with him, Lars was punched in the face and did not return to the hotel till the following morning. The next day, on July 7th, Lars showed back up at the resort and told his friends about the incident, and said that he had been at the hospital earlier that morning for a ruptured eardrum and injured jaw. He was prescribed the antibiotic cefprozil and was told to wait another day before flying home so that the airplane's changes in pressure would not impede his eardrum's healing. But of course, Lars's friends were getting ready to check out and fly back home to Germany that afternoon, but they offered to put off their flight and stay there with Lars. But he insisted that they go home, saying that it wasn't a big deal and he would simply stay the night at a hotel and fly back the next day. His friends obliged, checking out of the hotel that day and boarding a flight back to Germany without him. After this, Lars booked one night at the Hotel Color Varna, a cheap hotel near the airport. It was here where Lars's behavior began to take a strange turn. Around the time he checked into the hotel, he called his mother and made some unusual and disconcerting statements, saying he was in danger and that he was being followed, asking her in a voice barely above a whisper to cancel his bank cards. "I thought, God, my son is in danger," his mother told German TV. "I could hear his heart pounding over the phone. He said people were trying to rob him or kill him." Security footage from this night showed Lars pacing the halls, looking through the windows, and at one point hiding in an elevator. At 1 a.m., he was shown leaving the hotel for an hour. It is still unknown where he went in this time period. Early the next morning, on July 8th, Lars called his mother again, saying that the people following him were getting closer. He ended up getting a taxi ride to the airport and texted his mother to say he'd arrived at the terminal. However, before he could board the plane, he needed to be cleared by the airport's doctor, so he went to the office of Dr. Kostov, where he was described as really nervous and erratic. He was also reported as saying that he didn't trust the medication he had been given. Soon after this, a construction man entered the room, and Lars reportedly became even more nervous at this man's presence. He muttered something under his breath before saying, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." He then jumped from his chair, and leaving behind all of his luggage, Lars ran from the room and out of the airport and was caught on security footage doing so. He then ran through the airport's parking lot and jumped a fence, continuing to run into a heavily wooded area. Lars Mittank would never be seen again. Immediately after he vanished, speculation began that Lars Mittank was experiencing a paranoid episode. After all, there wasn't any evidence that Lars was being followed by someone, and some believed that his paranoia could have been brought on by a rare side effect of his medication. You see, cefprozil has been shown to occasionally bring on hallucinations and paranoia in subjects, but I should be clear that we don't know whether or not Lars took any of this medication in the first place. His paranoia could have also been caused by an undetected concussion. According to the Psychiatric Times, psychosis is a rare but serious side effect of a traumatic brain injury, and could be to blame for Lars's erratic behavior leading up to his disappearance. In 2018, the footage of Lars Mittank fleeing from Varna Airport was released online, where it rapidly garnered millions of views. This has caused Lars to often be called the most famous missing person on YouTube. But despite this widespread awareness of his case, police don't seem any closer to figuring out what happened to the 28-year-old. As of 2023, his case remains unsolved. Tammie Lynn Leppert was born on February 5, 1965, in Rockledge, Florida. Her mother, Linda Curtis, who later became her talent agent, started signing Tammie up for beauty pageants at only 4 years old, and by the time she was a teenager, she had accumulated hundreds of titles. When looking back on this time, Linda Curtis described her daughter as always sticking up for the underdog, saying in one interview that at only 9 years old, her daughter surrendered a beauty pageant crown to the broken-hearted runner-up after an official mistakenly announced the other girl the winner. Linda also said that her daughter made special visits to Brevard County inmates on Christmas Eve, and that at her core, Tammie was a kind, thoughtful, and charismatic young girl. After much success in Florida's beauty pageant circuit, Tammie began to seriously consider a modeling and film career. Her big break seemed imminent when in 1983, at 17 years old, Tammie landed a small role in the hit comedy Spring Break. Soon after this, she was hired for a brief role in Scarface, which was set to premiere at the end of that year. By all means, these roles were big steps in making Tammie's dreams come true, and some have reported that later that year, she was planning to move out to California to try and land more roles. But it was during the filming of these two movies that Tammie's demeanor started to take a noticeable turn. The first sign of this change came shortly after wrapping up filming on Spring Break, when one night, Tammie went unaccompanied to a cast party. When she returned, her loved ones said that she seemed like an entirely different person, and was suddenly depressed and paranoid. Another strange incident happened during the filming of Scarface, when during a violent scene, Tammie apparently broke down and was described as hysterical. Leading into the summer of 1983, Tammie became paranoid about her food being poisoned and refused to drink from open containers. She was also said to become reclusive, at times afraid to leave her room. Yet another incident happened on the last day of June in 1983, when her mother witnessed the following scene. Tammie went outside for some reason, which seems strange, considering how she was afraid to go outside. When the door slammed and locked behind her, she went berserk. She bashed in the window with a baseball bat, and reached her hand inside to unlock the door. She came running in, yelling and screaming. This incident prompted her mother to check Tammie into a mental health center, but the professionals found no evidence that she was under the influence of any drugs, and said that as far as they could tell, there wasn't anything wrong with her. She was released after 72 hours, and upon returning home, Linda began making arrangements for her daughter to see a psychologist. However, before this could be arranged, Tammie Lynn Leppert would vanish without a trace. The day before her disappearance, on July 5, 1983, Tammie met up with her old friend Rick Adams, whom she described as one of the last people she truly trusted. She confided in her friend that she had seen something she shouldn't have seen, but didn't go into any further detail. She also said that there was someone trying to kill her. This friend said that Tammie's fear seemed completely genuine, and that he knew it wasn't drugs, and that she didn't even drink. Together, they went to a church to pray, and he dropped her back off at her house around 11 p.m., agreeing to go back to the church the next evening. Right before Tammie went inside, she said to her friend, "I just want you to know I may have to go away for a while, but I also want you to know that I love you." This would be the last time Rick Adams saw his friend. The next morning, on July 6, 1983, Tammie and her mother Linda heard a car horn outside of their home. Tammie got up and looked out the window, and then walked outside, saying, "I'll see you in a little bit." "For some reason I was preoccupied that day," her mother said, "and I didn't pay much attention to it, and I'll never forgive myself for that." About 10 minutes later, Linda heard a car engine rev and got up to look outside the window. She saw her daughter in the passenger seat of a car driven by a 20-year-old male friend of Tammie's, a man she had previously told her mother that she was afraid of. It was around 11 a.m. when the pair pulled out of the driveway, making this the last time Linda Curtis ever saw her daughter. This friend of Tammie's, whose name has not been released to the public, said that they were headed to the beach, but somewhere along the ride, they got into an argument and he stopped the car in the parking lot of the Glass Bank in Cocoa Beach, Florida to let her out, and then drove away without her. He said this was the last he saw of her, and as far as we know, he was the last person to see Tammie Lynn. There were some reports that on the evening Tammie disappeared, she made a rapid series of calls to her Aunt Ginger's workplace in Cocoa Beach, but none of these calls were answered, as her aunt was out of town at the time. There was little I could find about these calls, only that Tammie left a message saying that she was calling from somewhere nearby. She was then said to have called her friend Ron, who also worked in Cocoa Beach, but he was also not present to pick up the phone. Those that knew Tammie felt that it was odd that she never tried calling her mother, with her aunt saying that the only way Tammie wouldn't call Linda was if something bad happened to her or if she was under someone else's control. These calls constitute the last known contact with Tammie Lynn, and there is little we can say for certain as to what became of her. From the beginning of the investigation into the 18-year-old's disappearance, Tammie's mother criticized Cocoa Beach police for their lack of initiative, specifically their refusal to properly investigate the man last seen with Tammie. In response, the police captain Bob Wicker said that he couldn't find a hint of foul play in her case, and that there was nothing unusual about her disappearance, except, quote, her family problems. He added that they had no reason to consider the man last seen with Tammie a suspect. Tammie's mother, on the other hand, felt that there was some larger force behind her daughter's disappearance, stating that Tammie had once confided in her that she had learned about a large-scale drug money laundering operation in Brevard County, Florida. She had stated that cops, bankers, and powerful citizens of the region were all in on the scheme. In 1990, the newspaper Florida Today reported that after this confession, Tammie's mother encouraged her to make a police report to the Brevard County Sheriff's Department. Reporters from this newspaper then met with the department's drug task force and asked if they recalled Tammie's report from 7 years prior. One officer said that he vaguely remembered it, but that, quote, it was so long ago, and the best I can recollect, the conversation didn't have anything to do with anybody trying to kill her. I think she came in to talk about stolen property she wanted back. When asked about the supposed money laundering scheme, this officer seemed bewildered and said that, quote, the last I heard, they thought that race car driver was involved. This race car driver he was referring to was a serial killer named Christopher Wilder, who during a 6-week period in 1984 murdered at least 8 women before being killed by New Hampshire police. He was known to lure women under the false pretense of being a fashion photographer, and some reports say that he was in Florida at the time of Tammie's disappearance. Despite there not being any conclusive evidence to link Wilder to Tammie, Linda Curtis ended up filing a wrongful death suit against his estate, stating that Wilder had met Tammie on the set of Spring Break and offered to photograph her many times. However, the truth of these claims is questionable, as after Wilder died, Linda dropped the case and said that she had never considered him to be a strong suspect, and that she had only sued him in hopes that he would have answered questions about Tammie. In the ensuing years and decades, Tammie's case grew cold and lost the media spotlight it once held. Tammie's mother passed away in 1995 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter, and since it has been about 40 years without any progress made in her case, many fear that we may never know what really happened to Tammie. As of 2023, her case remains unsolved. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm so thankful for all of your support. If you have any stories or topics you would like me to discuss in a future video, please let me know down in the comments, or you can email me, and I'd love to look into it. I hope you have a blessed day, and as always, stay safe.